Welcome back to the Rhetoric Warriors podcast, where we are teaching people the power of ethical only persuasion. They get rid of all this unethical talk. It's created the altered states of America. Complicated times require sophisticated techniques. Jump in and learn some rhetoric. I'm Dr. Dan French, American rhetorician, rhetoric PhD, escaped professor. I'm also a stand-up comedian and comedy writer from late night in Hollywood. There's a few jokes. You can find these if you go to Twitter. We're all over social media at Rhetoric War or Rhetoric Warriors. Try to find either one. A couple of recent jokes. We are one day within 24 hours of transitioning over to Biden when we're recording this. And there are going to be some differences in the outgoing and incoming administrations. Like one thing I've noticed is their VP, the GOP's VP, looks like a vampire with a fly on his head. The new GP or VP wears chucks and line dances with the little black girls. So there's a clearer brand difference. Some people are trying to make it pass some laws so that no national sites can be named after Trump because they don't want to see Trump's name anywhere, which I totally disagree with. I mean, just listen to how good it sounds. Trump National Landfill. That would be awesome. People would actually come to the landfill. And, it's America. We need new ideas. So I think, how about we just vote for how much money each person can have? Like, it's not communism. I just proposed that Jeff Bezos can only have $37,000 per year in his bank account at any time. That's it. Let's vote. Let's make it happen. So this is the Rhetoric Warriors podcast where I convert conservatives. Lots of fun doing that. I talk to comedians about their politics, interesting brains, and I glean cool stuff from persuasion pros, which is what we're going to do this week. Visit us at rhetoricwarriors.com. Sign up for one of the courses. Just launched my new course, Converting Conservatives. Change the world by converting one conservative at a time. Literally, if liberals, like 80 million people voted for Biden, if everybody just targeted one conservative and you got 20%, there'd be 100 million people voting next time the GOP's gone. Just saying. So take a course from us over there. My guest this week, God, we've known each other how long?
Long time, 40 years?
40 years? Like when you add it all up, yeah. We went to grad school together, UT Austin. David McLennan is a professor now at Meredith College. We were also faculty together at a small all-female Presbyterian college in the South named Peace College. Interesting experience that was. Dave is a rhetorician, even though he doesn't claim it anymore on his bio. We're going to talk about that. He's a trader, rhetorical trader. Now says he does political science, which he does. David's always done political science. It's always been his career interest, his academic interest. And so he lives in North Carolina, understands North Carolina politics. We're going to delve. Everybody, welcome Dr. David McLennan.
Dan, good to be with you. Great to catch up with you after this many years. You haven't changed at all.
Yeah, I try, but I can't seem to get any alteration in my basic personality. We did. We were roommates for a year.
Yeah, that was an interesting year. I mean, we went through lots of things. We had a next door neighbor who was arrested for doing child porn. I had my car stolen from the parking lot, and that was just
same apartment. That apartment was crazy. He was a cop who got arrested for pedophilia.
Yeah. And I think you got interviewed by the news about how well we knew him, and I forget what you said, but like he seemed nice to his dog. I mean,
yeah, that's what I said. He had a big dog, and they put that on the news. That me saying, well, he had a big dog.
That tells you about the news industry in this country. So.
Yeah, somebody's got to say something. Size of the dog, good enough. And I'll never forget the day when you walked in. He was like, "Did I park my car somewhere else?"
Yeah, I did. I remember they found it at the bottom of a lake.
Did they really?
Yeah, the Austin PD called me and said, "I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we found your car, and the bad news is it's at the bottom of a lake." And they charged me the towing fee to get it out of the lake.
How do you do? They can't do that.
This is 1986 in Austin. I think they can do whatever they want.
Is that what
So
drove you into
they,
politics? This kind of,
well,
unfair treatment of the
the
working
funny
man?
follow up to that is I got called for jury duty one time here in North Carolina. And it was an auto theft case. And so they're doing voir dire. And so the prosecuting attorney said, well, has anybody had their car stolen? I raised my hand. And so he started asking me questions. Well, what do you think of how the police handled it? So I told that story. Needless to say, I didn't make that jury.
Yeah, I've been called for jury duty like 7 times and never ever made it to the actual trial.
Well, I tell my students it's one of the things they ought to do. And so finally, I got my chance to be on a jury because usually I don't make it. And it happened to be a child molestation case. So be
Oof.
careful what you wish for. It
Oh.
was brutal. It was one of the most brutal times. And anyway, so yeah.
Well, tell us your background a little bit. I ran it a little, but you got a PhD in a cognate area. It says on here, cognate and rhetoric. I don't know what a cognate area is. Cognate area politics.
Yeah. So related. So it's a career trajectory that sounds more interesting than it really is, but taught rhetoric for a number of years. Dan and I taught together, as he mentioned. Then what happened at most small colleges was that students became consumers and they wanted, instead of rhetoric, they wanted different kinds of communication, organizational communication, PR, things that I couldn't comfortably teach. And I found that by the time I got to Meredith, I was doing applied communication within the field of politics. So I had done about 12 years of having a nonprofit in which I recruited and trained women to run for office. And really all I taught them was how to message, and had a very successful run at that. And so I found that even though I teach within political science, I'm really teaching students how to message effectively, because whether you're in electoral politics or you're working in government or you're in a nonprofit, it's really about messaging. So I really found that what I'm teaching, even though it has a different kind of shingle on the front of it, it's really very similar to what I was doing when I was a straight rhetorician.
Well, and I've always run into this out, in the real world where I don't have the cloak of academics around me, and people run into me and they ask what I do and what my background is, and I say rhetorician, and I have all sorts of versions of it, but master rhetorician, sneaky rhetorician, they're like, what's that? Like they never even heard that it's a real, like they don't believe it's a real PhD, right? They're like, what's your PhD in? I'm like, rhetoric. I'm like, that's not real. And then, it gives me that open opportunity to be like, oh, well, it seems like the Greeks knew it was real 2,500 years ago when it was taught in their primary education, and they're like, really?
Well, it's so interesting that in my career, other disciplines have discovered rhetoric, political science being one of them, sociology, many other disciplines.
Plundered it.
And
try to come in and take,
well, they think they've invented it.
Yeah, exactly.
and so they take this ownership. So when I go to academic conferences, I tend to go to the political communication division of political science conference. And it's so interesting. They do everything but study message. And I'm going, you call yourself communication, but yet they really are just doing surveys of people.
Yeah, they're doing target analysis, right?
Target analysis, yeah. And so I was talking at a conference. I was a critic on a panel of one of these big names in that field, and he was presenting his work. And I said, this might come across as heresy, but maybe if you looked at the message, you'd learn a little bit more. And he didn't really appreciate that comment.
Yeah, it's interesting though. Like I took a wide range of courses in my PhD because it was a new PhD program, and there was really only one rhetorician on staff. David Payne, who's great. I learned a lot from him, enjoyed his classes. But so I would go around the university and just grab things. And I took a sociology of work course, which was great. The guy was an awesome ethnographer. But I remember one time came in all excited one day, and he's like, "This is one of my favorite lectures." He goes, And so it's the sociology concept of labeling theory, that if you put a word on something, that people see it through the words, and I'm like, say, hey, hold on. That's called rhetoric. You can't just call it
Yeah.
labeling theory.
Well, you and I used to have long conversations, usually in a bar, about for a field that deals with communication, that we have used words so poorly to market ourselves. So that, when you introduce yourself as a rhetorician and people go, "What's that?" It is that same sort of thing. Like, how could they not know that? But on the other hand, it's like the rhetoric field has been so talking to one another instead of outwardly that it's a shame,
Yeah, and
because there's a lot to be
that's
gained from
yeah,
theory.
tons. And that's always sort of been my thing. Like, you remember this, like, come from working class in Kentucky, my very first reaction to all this stuff is, where have you guys been? You know, like, I need, people in Kentucky need this stuff. I can tell you that. Maybe you should try to get it out to the world. And even when I was talking to Rod Hart, a few weeks ago on the podcast, I just had that feeling again of, here's a super smart guy. It's got so much to say. And he's only reached, a few thousand people in his whole life.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a few people in the rhetoric field that have kind of transcended that, but you're right. There's so many good ideas,
Like
and
who
Rod
would you
Hart's a
say rhetorician, like straight up rhetorician that has any type of public,
I
fame?
guess, someone back in our day, Kathleen Jameson probably has
Again,
some.
how many thousands of people even know who she is?
Yeah, you have to tune in to PBS, the news hour, to get her take on the world. But yeah, I mean, certainly as compared to some of the other, you look in other fields where they're more common names, even when astrophysicists get to be, well known, like Stephen Hawking, you go,
Yeah,
wait a
where's
minute.
the Stephen Hawking's of rhetoric? We need
Yeah,
somebody
that's a good.
that, have some odd disease and, like,
Yeah,
be really smart. And yeah,
yeah, yeah.
it's
Well,
it
it's
is it is an interesting challenge, because even calling this brand that I've built up Rhetoric Warriors, like, everybody with rhetoric, they've only heard, the 1/10 of rhetoric, which is the unethical rhetoric, the hollow rhetoric. It's just rhetoric, political rhetoric. That's all they know from that word. So even that's why the slogan that I've got underneath the brand of ethical only persuasion, because people don't even know that's rhetoric,
yeah. Well, it's been so watered down, or thought of as nothing but just, people think of it as BS, which is, it's amazing around something like Martin Luther King Day, or, as we think about what Joe Biden will say tomorrow, and people are saying he ought to quote Lincoln a lot, the real power of ethical rhetoric. And then a day after the inauguration, people are going to be, have forgotten about it.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah.
Well, that tradition, and the traditional political rhetoric of, moralistic speeches, and fairly high-handed and grandiose and elevated talk, it doesn't work in modern entertainment. And so there is a disjuncture there. But what I try to do a lot of times is pull people over to, like, so my background became entertainment very quickly. Like, I merged those things over there, because the thing about Trump that you have to give him is that he imported entertainment principles, reality show, into politics, and that had never been done, and it just blew everything open. And it's still
Yeah.
not reset. Like Biden, I read your thing in the Hill about, Biden needs to talk, and it sounds like more traditional calls to,
Yeah.
like, FDR, I think it was, and maybe Lincoln, calls to reconciliate and unify, very traditional rhetoric. And I'd be like, yeah, I don't know if that's going to work.
Well, that is a question for the Democrats, not just Biden. I mean, you've often heard that, you know, they were afraid to attack Trump, at least until this year, or fight on the same kind of playing ground as he fights on. Because I think you're right, is that he could brought entertainment and just sort of a, 147 character attack on people that Democrats would try to refute with highfalutin kind of discourse. And so, it'd be interesting to see what as I watch someone like AOC on the Democratic side,
Yeah.
who has much better at social media, much better at the clapback, but still doesn't resort to the same sort of stuff that Trump does. You kind of go, yeah, that's kind of bringing it into the Democratic Party in a new way.
Yeah, you see a little freshness with it. I'd still think they need some really hardcore rhetoric training and modern like this kind of very modernist, entertainment rhetoric. Like they should put a really good shock comic, like a really good retort comic on staff. Like when Hillary tried to do it and called them basket of deplorables, I'm like, that's the worst writing I've ever heard for an insult. Like get a
Well,
good
the
writer.
rumor is that the historian John Meacham is assisting Biden with his speech, and which it'll make it sound exactly like you're talking about the old rhetoric. I'm wondering, someone who I follow a little bit, John Fugelsang. I'm sure you're familiar with
I know
him.
he is.
He's got that kind of, even though he doesn't talk about rhetoric as a discipline, he's got that kind of approach. He gets up in people's faces in a way that makes you think, as opposed to just viscerally react.
Yeah, and I follow if anybody, whoever's listening to this, should go to my Twitter and even just go and follow the people I follow, because that's a very curated feed of people that talk about politics and who are really good writers, like very sharp, snappy. A lot of them are comedy writers, and they're not even professional comedy writers. It's just good, really good at that sharp, quick, snappy line, which is what you need, because that's what fits in entertainment. And Trump was such a target. I'm like, who couldn't puncture that guy? Like just bring in, somebody to give you 5 lines and just hit him with it. Like,
well, I don't know if you remember the speech that Obama gave at the Washington Press Club.
Yeah, he went after Trump, right?
13.
Yeah.
I don't know who wrote. Who wrote that speech? Because he had some of those lines like you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm sure it was just comedy writers from one of the late night shows, probably.
Yeah.
And that's what you do.
That's the sort
you
of
sit
style,
around all the time. You learn how to do that. So once you get a really hardcore, snappy line, there's no defense against it, and it will outlive that moment, as Trump proved. It stays in the media. I wrote a joke once. Every once in a while, you write a joke in late night that leaps off your show and gets picked up and moved around the media. And it was when Pete Rose had come out and finally admitted that he bet on baseball. And the joke I wrote was, but still adamantly refuses to admit that he stole his hairstyle from a lesbian. And it was in Entertainment Weekly. I mean, it just sort of broke open for a while. And I got no credit for it because it came from the show. But that's the kind of stuff you need, where it's so potent, it just picks it perfectly. And it does some amazing things as a rhetorical artifact at that point.
Yeah.
So what do you think Biden is going to say? Do you think, I think Biden gives a good speech. He's obviously not as sharp as he was. But
no, I think people will walk away feeling comforted by his speech. He's not going to drop the carnage word on them like Trump did 4 years ago. But, it'll also be the kind of speech that it will not be any of the classics in political rhetoric kind of speech. I think what he'll do in the afternoon with his executive orders might be more significant. Right? He's going to drop, I think, 10 or 15 for the next 3 days.
Yeah, here comes the thunder.
Yeah. But, he'll be competent, maybe a gaffe or two, but it'll be Joe Biden.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, and he's in that unique position as a political candidate this time around, where he just needed to not be horrible. His opponent, Trump, was so widely hated, had done so much, that anybody that just seemed rational and kind of, reset the playing field kind of person was going to win.
I think his biggest applause line could be, "I'm not going to be in your news feed 24/7."
The last 10 days, right? Without Trump on Twitter. Do you feel the silence?
I do. And it's just, not only his feed, but everybody, commenting and retweeting and just go, phew, it's been nice. And so why didn't Twitter think of this earlier?
I don't know. It's almost like somebody should have suggested it to him at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, that interplay of politics and commerce that we're running into now. Like I said, Trump broke everything open, right? He started to use those social media platforms, absolutely uninhibitedly, and nobody's ever had that kind of access to the American public.
No, and whether he was pushing one of his resorts or his hotels or his daughter's product line, you go, not that anybody wants Joe Biden to do something like that, but you're right. You just got so used to it. And, no matter what Joe Biden does, it's going to seem quiet and calm.
Well, and
So,
politics is supposed to be boring, right? Government is supposed to be boring.
yeah, I mean, and Trump certainly, he could make the simplest thing the most dramatic, crap filled event of all time. And you're going, okay, signing a piece of legislation, unless it's the Civil Rights Act or something like that, is a pretty non event. But yet, his big flourishing Donald John Trump would be held up for the world to see. And, I think it'll be, as I said before the election, I thought Trump's people are just getting tired of him. And because that kind of shtick you can't carry on for forever. And so, Joe Biden will bring us back to the more George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, even Barack Obama level of politics.
Yeah, I mean, entertainment is exhausting. That's the nature of entertainment. It can't have any dead air. If you're a reality show politician or reality show character, it's about constant conflict. There's never a let up, and the whole country, really the whole world is exhausted by that kind of politics, that merger. I understand why it was effective, but it has a lot of negative fallout that we're all going, and the rhetoricians, to me, the rhetorical scholars and the academics still need to come to, bear on this and be like, hey, this may work, but look what it's going to do to the society.
Yeah, and I think there will be another Donald Trump in the future. And I think the rhetoric discipline has got to do a better job of what you're setting out to do, which is to be armed against that. Because I think for the first 2 years, people were just blown away and didn't know at all how to even process it. So, but I'm not sure we've got our heads around it yet. And God forbid we have another one, but it seems like a number of Republicans are certainly vying for the position.
Well, you and I we're two of the most educated people on the planet, literally, about rhetoric. We both have a PhD in rhetoric. Never took anything in entertainment rhetoric. Like, how do you counter, this type of, he imported business talk, and he imported entertainment talk, and those are outside the political realm. And so you need a new set of responses and counter persuasion and diffusion and all that. We weren't, rhetoric's not set up for that.
No, it's not. I mean, we still teach really in the same system that the Greeks did 2,500 years ago. Yeah. Logical proof. There's certain types of emotional appeals you make and certain types you don't. And you're right. Trump blew that all out of the water. I mean, there was, when he made the statement, or the statement was made of him, that he doesn't believe in words, that words are just simply vehicles. And that's so counter to what the whole tradition of rhetoric is, which is you own your words. That's part of your ethos. You go, wow. I mean, for him, changing his mind in mid-speech has had no consequences to him.
Yeah, it's that blitzkrieg, and I've laid out a lot of the right's techniques, the Trumpian MAGA techniques, trying to write up a playbook for it so that you can see what they are and figure out how to counter program it. But that, I call it that blitzkrieg rhetoric, where you never stop. Like, there's no slow down position. Like, rhetoricians break things down slowly. We slow it down, look at it, take it to its parts, find its allegiances to the past, Lincoln and all this kind of stuff. which makes good sense, but that's not the environment of a blitzkrieg, a rhetorical environment. They never will let you do that,
And they're unconcerned that they'll change their strategy 2 seconds later. I mean, the one thing you could say about studying rhetoric of Lincoln or something like that is the remarkable consistency across
Yeah.
time, and you could come up with patterns. And so we're trained to observe patterns, and there are no patterns in the kind of rhetoric you're talking about, which is just like, I can insult somebody one day, ingratiate myself the next day, and go back to insulting the next day, and there's no cost to it.
Yeah, I think you're
Yeah.
right. That idea of consistency, it's the right counter programs to what's been. And that's a pretty easy dynamic because everybody's always like, oh, like even Hart said this to me that Trump has a genius to him. I'm like, no, he doesn't. Like, I worked in entertainment. All that is reactive talk. Like, whatever somebody says, you take a counter position to it. And if you said something one day, you take a counter position to yourself because it's just counter positioning. And that technique creates conflict, creates variety. And those two elements are entertainment aesthetics: constant variety and constant conflict. They're not, like you said, they are not traditional political aesthetics at all. So if you're going to run into that kind of rhetorician, get ready to counter program that, because just trying to stay with consistency. And you saw the left do this over and over again. Like, he lies all the time. I'm like, yeah, we got it.
Yeah, I mean, the Washington Post cataloged 30,000 lies, and it came down to 44,000 votes. If it had gone the other way, even this year, he'd have been in the second term. So you're right that sort of response to Trump saying you lie is just insignificant. The other sort of enabler is the journalism field, because they are also trained to follow up on conflict. So every time he did exactly what you said, which was create conflict, resolve the conflict, recreate the conflict, they're sitting there making it headline or lead tweet or whatever it may be. And despite 4 years of people saying, well, just don't cover him, it's almost like catnip to a cat. They couldn't stop themselves.
Yeah. And, I have a background in journalism, undergrad in journalism, and worked in journalism a little bit here and there. And the reason I got out of journalism is that it's so programmatic. Like, it completely constricts your writing. And I hated it. Like, you can't say something that is obviously true. You can't take a too strong of an opinion. You can't, and all these things that journalism has wrapped itself in with its journalistic ethics have hobbled it to the point where it is not useful anymore in this type of rhetorical environment. It wasn't until the very end when like Acosta and these guys started taking chip shots at Kayleigh, during the press conferences. It's like they should have been doing that from day one. Like, why let somebody lie and then move on? That's insane. If somebody lies, you stay on it and everybody gangs up on them until they, get into it. And they'd act like, oh yeah, it's a lie. Let's move on.
And the interesting thing is, since I know a lot of journalists, they know better. Mm-hmm. Outside of their official capacity, they'll talk about, what a liar Kayleigh McEnany is, or whoever the person is. But yet, when it comes to covering that person, the norms of journalism, as you said, have not changed to keep up with the times.
Yeah, they're hobbled. And I'm like, those are really smart people. I would trust their read on things. I want to hear it. I don't want to hear, hobbled journalism that somebody else is using for, effect.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things I think with academics, like we should, I think, assert ourselves and say, hey, the environment has changed. Rhetoricians are nothing if not adapters. It's the whole Aristotle, every available means of persuasion. You see, it's grown up. Like, great. I'm going to jump over here and be like, hey, I'm going to retrain the journalists. So like I did a joke pretty early during the Trump thing about just give the journalists little signs. Everybody's got a sign and it says liar. And every time they lie, the whole room, holds up the sign, and there's your new visual. And it's, it completely changes the dynamic because that's what they're all thinking.
Yeah, but they're, in very somber tones trying to respond with, well, that's not what you said yesterday, Mr. President.
Yeah, they should be like, hey, fuck you. You didn't say that yesterday. Like even the whole, like this, oh, don't use normal talk in journalism. Like you guys have got to crack open the egg because you're going to get used and abused.
Yeah, it was the New York Times could never move away from calling him Mr. Trump. And you think of any publication that had the right to sort of drop some of its norms, the New York Times certainly did. Well, I mean, you and I talked about this years ago. I mean, journalism back in the 60s and 70s was trying to change with new journalism.
Yeah.
And yet that's, you can find it in some online places and things like that, but it has not infiltrated the mainstream at all.
Yeah. Have you ever read Hunter S. Thompson's eulogy for Nixon?
Yeah.
I mean, that's journalism. Like you talk
Yeah.
about a guy who eviscerates somebody. That's what I want from my journalist. Somebody
Yeah.
he had covered him for years. He knew everything about him. He knew everything that you'd want a journalist to know, and just tore into him with the most intense language and imagery and all the things that you want from a really good, rhetorician or writer, or
Yeah.
journalist. I want somebody
Yeah.
out there vetting these assholes because I don't get to go sit in the room.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. So you've actually worked within politics in North Carolina, and to me, like a lot of the things when you look at the GOP's current playbook, a lot of it comes from sort of the Jesse Helms, tradition of like really sort of unethical, hardcore, stain the other person politics, and he was using that back then, way back. But they were in the minority. There was only a few here and there that were going all the way to the dark side. But now it's been imported into the whole party where they'll all use this slander and libel, But you remember
Yeah,
Helms?
I mean, and it's a very subtle. I mean, Trump didn't do it subtly, but I think a lot of what you see coming out of the Jesse Helms tradition is very subtle. I mean, the ad that most people refer to is the two white hands crumpling up a piece of paper and throwing it away. It's a job offer, and saying in the background, well, I didn't get the job because the black guy got it. And so this was a 1990 TV ad created by someone here in North Carolina that I know. But yet, Helms stayed in office, but then it started being imported to other places. And now it is the coin of the realm. I mean, it is, racism is the kind of language of politics now. I mean, you saw what happened in the South Carolina Senate race. I mean, everybody thought Jamie Harrison, he was going to compete against Lindsey Graham, and Lindsey Graham smokes him by 10 points. Well, it wasn't a subtle campaign. And so, you're just seeing that. And that's what I think is another task for rhetoricians is how do you combat the kind of racial appeals that are being made that, because Democrats sometimes just respond with horror. Well, that was racist.
Right.
That doesn't move the needle, as that old cliche goes. But you're right. I mean, North Carolina sort of perfected some of those techniques. Helms was not afraid to insult his colleagues. He'd go after Republicans. I don't know if you remember this, but Jesse Helms sort of came out of the entertainment world too.
Oh,
he was one of the first. He was one of the first editorial speakers on television. The local, what was then the CBS affiliate hired him way back in the 50s to do a 3-minute commentary at the end of the evening newscast.
Really?
And so and so if you go back and watch some of the clips, I mean, some of his classics are, he would attack the university system here in North Carolina.
Oh, yeah.
And, he had a particular way of referring to UNC, and what UNC stood for. But anyway, I mean, so for years he worked for that TV station just doing 3 minutes of
So
blistering
he had
commentary.
good, yeah, he had, like, and a lot of those guys are super talented. Rush Limbaugh, all these different, right wing, commentators. They are amazing on camera, amazing voices. They can handle script. They can do emotion. Like they are
Yeah.
highly talented people.
So by the time Jesse Helms gets into politics or Rush takes it nationally, they have got the shtick down.
Well, and he was a
And so
character, man. You had to give it like he was an entertaining asshole to watch. If it
yeah,
wasn't for the lack of ethics and the horrible things he was getting into the world, they're interesting to watch.
they are fascinating to watch. And even toward the end of his life, you probably recall this. He and Bono, the U2 singer, developed quite a
I
relationship.
didn't know that.
And this, well, surprisingly, Jesse Helms supported money to Africa for AIDS. You would not have thought that, but he had some really weird, contrary positions, I should say. So anyway, he and Bono became very close at the end of Helms's career, life actually, because of the AIDS issue.
Well, and a lot of those guys, like I've worked with, some of the biggest talent in Hollywood, as far as speaking talent and like comedians and things like that. They're incredibly charming people, incredibly
Yeah,
delightful, and I think that a lot of the politicians people don't really understand is, especially now, they're mouthing scripts that are handed down to them from the GOP, from the, think tank down into the politicians to the media, and they're just readers, really. Their talent and they're good at it, but they're charming
we're
people.
yeah, and the really good ones like Helms not only develop their skills, in the entertainment world, but when they go on the campaign trail back in the pre-COVID times and do these 25-person events and can make the material fresh to a group that they, same script over and over and over again, but keep it fresh. It is really good to see a politician, even one you disagree with, who is really good at it.
Yeah, and I watched this with Lindsey Graham in his little, impeachment talk, where he kind of sideswiped Trump just a little bit, saying he's a consequential president, even though I think he's done some things wrong. But I was watching like, oh, there's the real Lindsey Graham. Look at all the talent right there. He
Yeah,
sort of turned it all down during the his election because he was trying to go up a different avenue emotionally with he was crying on camera and he's like they've got all this money against me, and he was taking that victim thing, which the
yeah,
GOP loves to use because
right,
it's empathizing with a victim for people who feel like victims. And so it's
yeah, yeah.
that's a strong piece of rhetoric. But then once he won, he went back to like very well spoken, very engaging, and you're like, oh, there he is.
Yeah, he's been a remarkable person over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of being able to get out of his persona and get back into it so quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought one of the most amazing performances is during the Kavanaugh hearings when he just literally went berserk. And yet, with that very short time period, he could come back into that Southern genteel persona so easily. And you just, on one hand, you're just shaking your head. On the other hand, you're just admiring that
Well,
performance.
when you see a really good actor, and that's what these guys are, it is fascinating the way that they can completely lose who they are, lose what the what is there, and become this other thing, not just in a way of like but like completely inhabit that character. And you're starting to see again, I think that's getting more and more imported over as a necessary component of making it in politics. And I'm not sure the left has really seen that yet. It's done on the right, and again, so when you don't have the ethical restrictions, acting in sort of politics is an unethical technique. You're supposed to be who you are, talking about your honest views on the world so that we can predict you and know who to vote for. But the right doesn't use that. They're like, I'm going to act however I want in order to get this vote.
What's interesting is one of my side gigs is I do polling. And every election season, I always ask a series of questions what voters want. And the word authenticity appears close to the top of all the qualities. And yet, what you and I have been talking about, it's one of those things. They say they want authenticity, but that's not what they want. They
Well,
want
can they
somebody who
recognize
performs.
it?
I don't, that's the question. Maybe a generation or two ago, they had a better sense of it. But I think authenticity today means what's closest to what I need at the moment.
Hmm.
So it's authentic with my feelings, not authentic with, traditional like consistency and things like that.
Yeah, that's
I
an
mean,
interesting concept. That there's a comedian in the South. There's a lot of big characters in the South that the rest of the country doesn't know about, but they've been making $1 million a year doing stand up forever. But there's a woman named Etta May, and she bills herself as the Arkansas housewife from hell. She's actually an Italian Brenda Ferrari, which probably isn't even her real name, but she's from Iowa, and she's playing a character. She has a fat suit on, she has a costume, but she never breaks character, and she's been doing this for 30 years. Everybody thinks that that's who she is, and the South is like, yeah, she's so good at it. It plays authentically. But again, that's what a really good actor does, is they can easily portray an authenticness that a lot of people can't pierce, you know?
yeah.
Like you're
I mean,
clearly being an actor here. You're not a nice guy. I know that. And you come across as
well, you
flirty.
pick up a few things studying politics over time.
So tell me a little bit more about working in politics, like coming from academics over into politics, because it's something I never really worked in politics. I got interested in, sort of breaking the stuff I do from rhetoric over into politics because of Trump and MAGA. But I'm looking to sort of, understand that world more and like trying to actually have an effect on it. What's been your experience there, like taking from academics over into people who are actively doing politics?
Well, for many years, I ran campaigns, and so I was in charge of message and all the other things with campaigns. And I'd work for candidates that I generally agreed with or liked as a person. And I'm getting to your question in just a second. I got out of that, 15, 16 years ago, when one of the candidates asked me, what should I believe?
Ah,
Like I was supposed to give them their issue positions, not make their issue positions more palatable.
sure.
And I said, are you kidding me? And she said, no, I don't know what to believe. You need to tell me. And I said, okay. I couldn't deal with that sort of, and you said it well, it's a performance. I mean, she was a good performer. She had a lot of skills with people, particularly interpersonal skills. But it was interesting working with some politicians. I worked primarily with from the state level on down. I never ran a national campaign or anything like that. But even statewide candidates, they're smart people. I
Yep.
mean,
Yep.
you don't become successful. And I didn't work with some of the people that we could obviously mention that may not be smart, but the people I worked with, law degrees from good schools, good professional backgrounds, they weren't invested in issues. I mean, I laugh now when I see politicians who talk about principle, and when I now see the Republicans talking about, well, we've got to talk about the debt now after 4 years of not caring. It's I think a lot of people that I've seen now in politics, I mean, it's a cliche to say this, but they are driven by the power. I mean, I'd like to think, when I first started working with politicians in the late 90s, early 2000s, these were sometimes school board candidates who just could get into a dissertation with you about curriculum matters that would make your eyes cross. So, there were times where I worked for people who just simply needed to be able to translate that passion and knowledge to the everyday
Good
person who would vote.
wonky government people, right? Because that's what
I mean,
government's
really,
supposed to be.
a real bureaucratic sense about them. And just over the time, I've sort of run into too many people. There's an organization here in the state that trains candidates, and they do a good work. But I used to work with them, and it was the same sort of thing. You get somebody who had a lot of talent. I mean, just a lot of natural ability. And yet you could tell, one day you said, the Democrat could win this race, they'd be a Democrat, and a Republican win this race, they'd be a Republican. I just went, wow. So it's a tough field, and
so was that
I still work.
morally unnerving to you, or was it intellectually unnerving to you?
It was both. I mean, sort of when the person first told me what should I believe, that got me on many levels. I mean, it was just like, okay, have you not thought about this? Have you not read? Because one of my things, this is my academic training. When I first would sign on with a candidate, I would produce all these policy papers, policy briefs on every imaginable topic. Because I just thought, you cannot go out there in front of a crowd and not be able to answer a question about.
Right.
And, some of them made a half-hearted attempt to read it. Some of them did a good job reading it, but it was just sort of, I quickly moved away from that. But the moral thing was tough too. I mean, to find that, there are people out there who just simply will say whatever they want. I mean, I see Ted Cruz, speaking of someone in your state, he's, number one in his class at Harvard.
No, he
Law
wasn't.
Review.
That can't be true. That is absolutely not true.
Well, anyway,
Can't
it may
be.
not be, but
Can't be. Absolutely impossible.
On how he performs. But I happened to be at the Republican National Convention in 2016. And you will appreciate the entertainment value of this. So, leading up to that, he and Trump had been going back and forth, and Trump had insulted him, and Cruz had called him whatever he called him. Cruz is giving his big speech in Cleveland outside the arena. So he had probably a couple thousand people there, and he was, how he can get going. Trump helicopter picked him up at the airport. He buzzed Cruz. I mean, he was probably a couple hundred feet above Cruz in the crowd, so he just completely drowned Cruz out. It was the most amazing performance. And you would have thought that, that Cruz would have just lost it and just gone after Trump's throat. He was in the convention all that night. I mean, he didn't come out 100% behind Trump, but it was, he's already insulted his wife, his father, and buzzed him at a convention speech, and he's supporting crazy. Trump at the convention. Whatever.
Well, like one of the guys that I interviewed from Hollywood is a showrunner, buddy of mine named Eddie Feldman, and he ran Dennis Miller. And so he's used to dealing with, crazy and with politics. And one of his other jobs was he was the head writer, executive producer of storylines for WWE. So he would come up with the big story arcs and all that stuff for wrestlers and for these massive, wrestling events. And same thing, like when you're starting to do entertainment politics, you need big signaling. And that's why like something like that with, going after somebody's wife, saying your dad was working with Castro, buzzing people with helicopters, you're just looking for heightened conflict. And again, Trump, having come from Hollywood, knows that it does not matter what the conflict is, doesn't matter what the ethics of it are or anything else. And that's what eventually tripwired Trump, is the whole Capitol insurrection is too big. It's too visual. You can't overcome that rhetorically. Before it was like hidden phone calls and stuff like that, going after other politicians and saying nasty shit and all that. People are like, yeah, that's small, scuffle, forgettable stuff, even though it's horrible, for real, like Putin and that. But when he did that big, insurrection, and you got all those visuals on TV, I don't see how the GOP comes back from that, because that's going to stain them forever. I mean, see it's too big a signal. It's too big.
Yeah, it's huge. But, to watch some in the GOP like Hawley continue to sort of, not completely disavow that and not completely push Trump away is just mind-boggling. I mean, it's almost like you're so involved in your audience mean, whatever, your MAGAs, you can't step back and see, that's one thing rhetoric has always impressed upon me. The study of rhetoric is, you've got to completely understand your audience, and not just the narrow segment of your audience. You've got to understand and that's where I think, I think Trump is done. I mean, I don't think, he runs 4 years from now, no matter what the Senate
No,
does. I mean, I think
there's no
you're
chance.
right. The signal was too big. But, it's these other people who are relatively new in their careers. You're going, I don't see it.
Yeah, it's an odd choice. And I get it. I mean, there's enough political energy behind the anti-hero, which is
Yeah.
essentially all this is from a narrative perspective.
Yeah.
For the, this whole thing to go, okay, I can still stay in that energy. That audience isn't going away. It's enough to, elect me and maybe take me up to the national level. I get the calculation of it. And especially if you drop the moral or ethical components, which clearly politicians, especially at the national level, are just fine with and really
Yeah.
good at. I would have if you have a conscience, people are going to see it. And like, it's a handicap for a rhetorician at that level. So I see him move over there, and you're starting to see, they're trying to break down the evilness of the big signal, the insurrection, like even saying, we deserve to be there and nobody was really hurt. The fact that people died and the guard died, if somebody hadn't died, they'd probably be able to skate past it.
Yeah. But the fact that, it's not just that 5 or 6, depending on how you're counting it, people died, but that, the visual had them attacking police. You're exactly
Viciously,
right.
like
The signal
pounding and
I mean, the signal is too dramatic. But, to disavow the visual that we have, increasing amount of visual evidence that we have, I probably get asked more often than not, in the last couple of days, what do you think the Congress is going to do to its own members? And like, will they expel Hawley and Cruz? And on the House side, we have a North Carolinian who's kind of a ringleader. And I said, that's the interesting rhetorical challenge. Will McConnell, who's an institutionalist, is his calculation, get rid of them and perhaps piss off a certain segment of the base? Or can you deal with the firestorm that?
Well, they've made that, right? I mean, that's the right has become, and see if you agree with me on this, the Tea Party, like it started with Gingrich and the Contract for America.
Yep.
They radicalized the party into an obstruction party. They went farther over and grabbed the Tea Party people because they were good, big signaling visualists and all that constitutionality warped rhetoric, around that. They allowed it all in. They allowed the evangelism, which had always been in there, to kind of grow. And so they made a pact with it. And the thing that I know for sure, that when you adjust to the crazy doesn't just, sit in its chair where you allow it takes over. And so it's taken over. And now, like Hawley and these guys, they don't have anything else. They can't be traditional conservatives, austerity rhetoric, that kind of traditional values. That's gone from their major platform. You're starting to see they try to pull it back up with like this, like the debt, that's austerity rhetoric. It's just hobbling rhetoric to try to keep the Democrats from having, any resources. But they've done that for a long time, but that was the core of the party. And now it's shifted over to this other, third has become the 2/3. And I don't know, like McConnell can't just put that back in a bottle.
No, but the danger on the other side is to do exactly what you said that Trump did. You keep escalating, and eventually, a Trump, a Cruz, or a Hawley has his own January 6th. They get so over the top that, even many of the crazies go, that's too far.
That's too crazy for us. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to watch, and I'm curious as to where it's going to go next. Like, I do think it played itself out. I think Trump is unique. He's a unique phenomenon. He had a unique background, 40 years in the American consciousness and the media, and everybody knew him, and he was a clown. And then they changed his persona with, The Apprentice to some kind of business elite, guy. And then that let him in, to politics. That gave him a little bit of expertise, credibility, and let him jump in. And he's good with script. None of these guys are good with script the way he was,
No.
and he jumped on it and just blew it open, destroyed all the debates. Nobody could debate with him because he's great with script, the very narrow type of script that he did. I don't see anybody else coming up being able to do that.
No, and that may be where the Republicans are, which is you've got an audience primed for that sort of approach, and nobody able to deliver it. And you kind of alluded to this. When you've got a pretty crazy group of followers and you're not living up to their expectation, they turn on you just as fast as.
Yeah.
And so, a Don Jr., who is not nearly as talented as his
No,
father,
not
could
close.
be really in trouble.
Yeah.
I mean,
They'll get up and try
like
to do that stuff, and it just won't work. Like you
no,
even saw with, I think even Lindsey Graham and these guys, they can't really pull off that script, so it's not like when he was doing his grievance politics. It's like, everybody's just kind of like, this is uncomfortable.
yeah. Not nearly as uncomfortable as Mike Pence, but
Well, Pence is a great example of a guy who, very traditional Republican, very, just wrote in on the Christianity and the sort of measured, hate, keep it, like you said, keep it neutral language, keep it subtle so that you can't see it too much. But, he can't handle the kind of Trump venom. Like those guys
no,
pick it up and it just takes them, they can't even come close to talking like that.
no, no.
So I think, it'd be interesting to see, like, if the Democrats go and poach next time from entertainment. Like I'm not sure Kamala is the answer. I think millennial politics are interesting, and we'll see if there's enough energy behind that to actually elect a president. But I would go and get Tom Hanks or somebody.
Do you think he's got he's got the star appeal. I was thinking, I was going to ask you that question, who you think out of the entertainment world, maybe a little younger than Hanks, would be sort of, not, I hate to say Trump-like, but has some of the skills that Trump has and be able to translate it into politics. Because, a lot of the names that I hear sort of periodically whisper like they're interested in politics are kind of people that are long, I think, not appealing to the current Democratic base.
Yeah.
Because, Tom Hanks is interesting. I bring up Tom Hanks in my class and I kind of get a lot of quizzical looks.
Yeah, they don't know who he is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really.
Did he just do a movie or something with somebody, a co-star, a actress who said that she didn't know who he was?
Yeah, there's a lot
thought
of
I read
that.
that.
And he is too old, the problem is, like, in Hollywood, you've had that sort of super moralized leading man for a long time, like your Henry Fondas and your Jimmy Stewarts and those kind of guys. Even Reagan, sort of came from that kind of background as a
Yeah.
dramatist. And you kind of had the Martin Sheen, you had, Alec Baldwin, but they're too rough around the edges, to sort of slide into the fully moralized leading man. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there is somebody like that. I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah. I think you're right that the Democrats need to learn from what's going on for the last 5 years and try to adopt some of the rhetorical strategies, but you've got to also have the right person. It's I'm thinking about the next crop of Democrats who are post Biden. You've got some, I just can't think of anybody who just kind of.
There isn't, right? Like, and it needs to be still for America, for this, racist base America. It probably still needs to be a young, virile male, white would be preferable. Like, the fact that Biden got elected just because he fits that, super traditional, non-threatening, like he's even non-threatening to racists. You know,
Yeah.
they recognize like, yeah, he's an old white guy. At least I got that. I'm not, I'm
Yeah.
not too scared of him, even though he likes LBQT and, you know, LBGT and, all these different things he talks about, good talk about the liberals, but yeah, he's still a white guy.
Well, the Democrats, and particularly in 2018, 2020, when they went for white males, they had a sort of model. They wanted to get somebody who was a vet. So, like the guy up in Pennsylvania who won in 2018, here in North Carolina, we ran a guy for the U.S. Senate who's mid 40s, had served in I think Afghanistan, and everybody felt sort of about him. I mean, he had some other issues too, but again, I think it's just the Democratic leadership sort of, they say in certain districts we can run the AOCs and the Tlaibs and people like that, but when we get to a big statewide race, particularly a purple state, we've got this model in mind. Because here in North Carolina, the other candidate running for the Democratic nomination for Senate was an African American woman from the northeastern part of the state, really progressive, and all the money came in for the white vet, and he ends up losing to a vulnerable senator. So
Yeah, you know who I like? I think Stacey Abrams would be a really interesting national candidate for president, because I think she's got a little more aggro power. I really like Kamala, but I think
yeah,
she's confusing in some ways to people with the sort of, East Asian like mom and the black dad. And Stacey Abrams is something like even the racist will give it up to a really hardcore, in your face, not going to back down black woman, and she
particularly
has,
somebody who produces results. I
yeah,
mean,
she's got some pop, man. I'm watching her for the next, and well spoken and all that kind of stuff, can handle script. It'd be interesting to see. I'm
yeah, you
curious.
might be onto something. She might be the hope, because because the bench is a little thin otherwise.
Well, and you've seen it I think Bo Biden was being, groomed for this and, dies. And then I think the John Kennedy Jr. was, being groomed for this. And so you've lost a couple of your like superstar pedigreed, men coming up through this. And, there is a vacuum for that stuff. So
Yeah,
it's interesting to see what's available. But I'm sure the rhetoricians will clean it all up and we'll make sure the world works right. That's
of course. If we ran the world.
that's what we do. Well, man, this is super fun. I'm gonna have you
Yep.
back on because it's
All right.
always fun to actually talk to rhetoricians.
Yeah, it has been a lot of fun, and I think you're doing a good thing with your podcast and with your other work, because as we talked about in the podcast, rhetoric needs to sell itself better, and its ideas are valuable.
Oh my God! Like if we would just give people like one of my taglines for this is get 100 million people trained into rhetoric so that they call everybody out when they're using bad rhetoric. Just get it out of the system. I totally trust Americans and human beings in general to make decisions if they have clean discourse. But I don't trust them at all if they have polluted discourse. It's a horrible system for the human brain. It's overwhelming and people can't handle it.
Well, it's also humans are unfortunately very lazy, and they fall back on patterns of behavior and talking points. If we can get them just to break out of their talking points and actually have conversation, to use actual, I hate to use this term, authentic rhetoric, or as you like to say, ethical rhetoric, I think the world would be a better place.
Yeah, well, nobody will even listen to the podcast, so we're still fighting up big hills. But it's always fun, man. I'm having fun with this thing, so I figure like it's got to have some value. So again, I
There you go.
appreciate it very much, Dave
Sure.
McLennan. Everybody check him out. You had a blog, right? Thinking something.
Thinkingaboutpolitics.com.
Yeah, check that out. And I
Yep.
always got interesting things to say, and we will come back around and talk to you again at some point. And
Sounds
this
good.
has been the Rhetoric Warriors podcast. And remember, don't mistake thinking for good thinking. We'll be back.